Welcome back to DissedMedia, a startup story. My name is Ben Olmos, founder and CEO of DissedMedia. This is a podcast where I take you along my journey of starting DissedMedia from the ground up. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. I'm happy you found us, and hopefully you'll like what you hear. For those of you coming back, I'm glad that we piqued your interest enough for you to return, and I hope that you enjoy this next step in our journey. This show is all about documenting DissedMedia's startup journey and keeping you in the loop every step of the way. I'll be keeping you up to date on meetings, phone calls, emails, and all the things that I need to do to get this business up and running. So with that, let's pick up where we left off last time. Okay, welcome back everybody to DissedMedia, a startup story. I'm your host, Ben Olmos, and again, joining us is Alan Landry. Alan, how are you doing?
Doing great. I'm hoping this isn't strike three, buddy. This is the third podcast I've been privileged to be part of. So thanks again for letting me play in your sandbox. Doing great.
Yeah, no worries. So, one of the things that we talked about in the last episode, and it was funny because we were talking a little bit before we got rolling here, that I have been a little bit behind in things, and the goal of the podcast is to have it out once a week repetitively and on time. And due to my schedule and work and all kinds of stuff, I am so far behind. And it's funny, I was editing it and listening to the part where we were talking about time management and realizing how terrible I've done with that this week. But one of the things I think that is important to bring up and talk about, and bringing it back to people who are starting businesses and wanting to do your own thing, is you're going to be faced with barriers and roadblocks, and things are going to come up because life happens. And I think one of the things, and I'm going to pull from my academic experience here, one of the things I think we do a really bad job of when it comes to teaching people, and it's a double-edged sword. We give you goals and deadlines so that you get into the practice of accomplishing your goals and getting things done on time. And that's a really important aspect of life. We have to do that. But we don't do as good a job of teaching how to accommodate for when things go off the rails. And I think what it oftentimes does is it instills in people this perception that when you fall behind or you get off track, that you have somehow failed, and there's a punishment to that. And one of the things about starting a business, running a business, is that not everything is going to go to plan. You're going to have to pivot. You're going to have to adjust. Things are going to run behind at times. It's never where you want to be, but it's a reality of what happens. There is no such thing as flawless execution. And as somebody who's been a project manager for many years and has managed a lot of large-scale projects, the one thing that I came to really not enjoy was that expectation around flawless execution. Execution is not going to be flawless, but it is going to be planned, and it is going to have an overarching goal, and we're going to pivot and move around and adjust to the things that happen as we're trying to get there. So, I would have to say this last week and a half hasn't been my best week and a half. I've been a little off my game with DissedMedia. I've been a couple days out from putting new content on the daily pitch. I'm behind in getting the podcast up and running. Even as we got going with this podcast, I did not do as good a job of following through with hey, Alan, this is what we're going to be talking about. And it's on. I didn't send you a calendar invite. We just kind of went back and forth on the day and time. So this is a good lesson for folks in not everything went as we wanted it to. However, what we're going to do is we're going to identify and recognize and acknowledge the fact that we got off track, and then we're going to create a plan and we're going to get back on track. So for those listening, as you continue to take in these things, know that is what we're doing. Alan, what are your thoughts real quick before we launch into this next part on time management, on strategy? You've got an extensive military background, and I'm sure you've heard the term flawless execution. How do you how do you deal with the expectation of that at certain levels when, commanding people or working with other people, or working against deadlines? And when something goes wrong, how do you work around that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but I want to back up first on this whole thing about time management. The thing that's important with you is, unlike a lot of people, you appreciate and realize when you're off track. And so many people, when you ask them, where do you spend your time? I usually begin with, how do you define wealth? And I ask to see two things: show me your calendar, and then show me where you spend your money. Where you spend your time is really hugely important. So oftentimes people, really, myself included, lose track of that, and we think we're busier than we really are. I think in the military, one of the things that was so important as an operational planner, and it's not a lot different, I don't think, Ben, than the business world, is you're confronted with a living, thinking, breathing enemy, another side, an opponent that's trying to do their best to counter your best. And so you begin with an appreciation that there is no plan, none at all, no matter how good it is, that survives the first contact with the opposing force. And so that requires, in operational planning, for a person, number one, to have a good background in strategic planning, to say, what's my strategy and what am I trying to accomplish? And that becomes your pivot point. Everything else can flow and follow from having that overarching strategy. And then as you execute that strategy and you come up against an opposing force, you've got to have branches and sequels off of that basic plan that allow you to stay true to your vision and true to your mission, and at the same time respond to a living, breathing, thinking enemy. And in the business world, that enemy can be time. And it can be time. And it's not just the marketplace, and being able to pivot to that and say, well, okay. And so here's a classic example. This week, you're talking about the things you wanted to get done and didn't get done. Well, you're not going to sit there and just jettison all that. You're going to build another plan. That's a branch and a sequel off of your original plan. And so having the sense to realize there's no flawless execution and never will be. And if you ever think that is, you're going to be sadly disillusioned, and you're going to piss off a whole bunch of people when you try and can't do it. So hopefully that kind of responds to it.
Yeah, no, it does.
What you and I have probably both worked for people that really perhaps weren't as strategic in their thinking as they should have been, and they didn't understand that whole business about no such thing as flawless execution. I grew up in a world that said luck is the intersection of preparation with opportunity. Well, you control the preparation, but you don't usually control the opportunities and strategies there to help you figure out what that's going to look like and then pivot to it. And so the person that doesn't believe in flawless execution is going to smile all the way through all the mess ups that happen, adjust to it, pivot to it, keep smiling and keep working toward their ultimate goal. And you said that up front earlier. You got to have your basic goals. And those may change a little bit as the environment changes, to be sure. But again, to have that kind of focus point, and then to have your whole team, like you do with your board now, trying to keep us all focused on our mission and vision here. Let's make this happen, right?
Yeah, it's funny because one of the things I would say when I was managing people, if I had somebody who did something and it wasn't right, we could admire the problem and we could just continue to rehash the problem, and we could talk about how come, or we can really just try and understand what led to the mistake, and then try not to do that again. Put controls in place, put in some mechanisms to say, how do we avoid that from happening in the future? And then you move on and you move ahead, because things are going to mess up. You're going to screw up. Things are going to happen. The accidents, mistakes are going to be made. And sometimes just something doesn't happen because somebody wasn't paying attention. Okay, so what can we do to mitigate that as we move forward? Let's put that plan in place and let's just move forward. But I think what always annoyed me as an employee, as a worker, is to constantly rehash and constantly relive and constantly revisit what's wrong or continue to bring up what happened. It's like none of that is helpful. It only helps by correcting what happened and moving ahead.
So Ben, I wrote my first master's thesis on joint operations and lessons learned. I had just spent 3 years in the Pentagon in the Joint Staff and the Army staff working in some high level strategic classified activities. And I was stunned at how often operations occur in the military and something doesn't go right. A mistake happens, to your point. And then we say, well, why did that happen after the thing's all over with? Hopefully the mission doesn't fail. Hopefully we could pivot to that and correct it. And then we go through this whole process of lessons learned. Okay. And I got very frustrated with that because too often lessons learned were simply lessons recorded and not shared. They were never learned. And so if they're not learned, they're repeated. And so let's go back into your point where you're talking about this in the business world. What often happens, and I saw this in the aerospace defense company that I work with. We were a manufacturing company and some things wouldn't go right. When it doesn't go right, if you've got good leaders invite the problem. They believe that execution's not flawless. They want to know about it. There were some other occasions that occurred where the leaders weren't open to that. And guess what happens? The minute that your team believes that you don't want to hear the bad news, you're not going to hear any more bad news. You're not going to hear any news. And then you're going to ship bad product out the door. And then you're going to blame your team for what in fact is a leadership failure. So to tie all that kind of in a nice little package, good leadership builds a team around a strategic vision and a mission. It builds a team that knows that things aren't going to go right. It builds a team where it's okay to walk in with bad news and say, hey, this happened. How do we fix it? And then when you have that conversation with your whole team, you don't rush to failure by solving the wrong problem. You try to figure out what the root cause was. And then from that root cause, make sure that problem doesn't happen again. And so all this is tied together toward being able to pivot and to be successful overall so that no matter what comes up against you or what kind of odds that you're having to face, that you're able to be successful in what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part of doing anything. And, just being able to kind of recognize where things went off track. So certainly
Yes,
in what we've done, what I've done, shouldn't say we, it's really been all my issue. What I've done this week is definitely kind of put us behind. And the reason I feel this pressure around it too, about being behind, even being a couple days off, we're in a media business and it moves really fast and it changes really quickly. And if you're not in front of people constantly, you lose position. So that I think just adds to the pressure of what we're doing is having that. But something that you said when we first started, you said, show me your calendar and show me your wallet. Well, I've been focusing on my wallet. And when I say that, what I mean is, and we've talked about this before, I have other obligations outside of DissedMedia. And we've talked about DissedMedia's profitability, and right now it's not there. We're working on that. We're going to get there. But, the reason why I have been kept away from some of this stuff is that, I have some other competing priorities that I have to put ahead of this. And there are going to be times when that happens. So everybody is kind of in a different place when they're doing their work. And this is why we want to build this business up to a point where we can afford to bring people on to help at those times when I have to step away because I've got other obligations I need to serve, to be able to have somebody come in and make up for that. So everything will happen in time, but right now it's not going to be happening yet. But so let's take a little bit of a turn, because this week, Alan, I mentioned last week that I wanted to get into getting people to understand a little bit more about the people that I wanted to bring onto the board to help advise, to help, build up DissedMedia and the Daily Pitch into something. And you and I were introduced to each other through our mutual friend, Keith, who is also on the board, and really gotten to enjoy our conversations. I love talking to you and hearing your wisdom and your insights. And you have a lot of stories, one of which, by the way, I was trying to, we'll talk about this in a little bit. If not this show, then we will in the future. But you mentioned the sword that you have behind you, and you had a story to it. I did such a terrible job of representing your story, so I'm not gonna get into that right now. But I was trying to explain to my wife, why it's at the top of your credenza there behind you, and I did such a terrible job of representing it. So, but I wanted to get into a little bit of your background because, briefly, you've stated you were a West Point grad and you worked with a missile defense company, but there's a story there. So I kind of want to go back a little bit. You started in the military. Without going way, way back, but let's start with the military. How did you find that this became your path? And then what kept you in it for the duration of time that you were there?
Yeah, well, grew up in a lower middle class background in East Texas, and I wanted to get out of there. And I didn't want to sack groceries at Kmart, and so academics were a ticket. It was 1970 when I graduated high school. Vietnam War was still going, and while I didn't particularly want to go, if I had to go, I wanted to go as an officer. So academics were my ticket out of town. I received, because mom and dad couldn't pay to send me to a 4-year school, I applied for the Army ROTC scholarship. So it was a way to improve my life and to become a professional, gain a profession, and gain some leadership experience. And so about that time, West Point asked me if I would consider applying because of some academic scores I'd gotten. And so academics got me into West Point. And of course, you got all the other stuff. You got to be physically fit, leadership, and all those other kind of things. And I spent 4 years there. And it was a very, very powerful experience academically, emotionally, and physically. And so when you graduate after 4 years of school, you're commissioned a second lieutenant. And so you pick a branch. And at that time, your branch was picked by how you ranked in your class. I ranked high enough to pick. I was the number 2 person in my class to pick air defense artillery. I wanted a little bit of a technical piece of it, and ADA was moving in that general direction. So it wasn't just the infantry, which everybody's aware of, and the armor with the tanks and the field artillery with cannons. I wanted something a little more interesting. So I actually spent 5 years in, which was my commitment. You don't know this, but I got out after my 5 years. I resigned my active duty commission, and I went to work with industry, Procter & Gamble, as a production manager for Pampers. And
that's a whole different type of explosive there.
A whole different type of explosive coming, and it's the same business. It's all about protection. So I went from protector ends of the world to covering them, and that was a incredibly frustrating experience for me. P&G is a great company, don't get me wrong, but I got to tell you, Ben, I missed leadership. I missed being responsible for something that I thought was significant and important. And in the 5 years that I had been in the Army, I got out as a captain. I enjoyed leadership, and it was a privilege to wear the uniform. So I left P&G and went to work for American Hospital Supply Corporation. And I was their number 1 sales rep, percent to quota, the first quarter I was with them. And I'm at Amelia Island, and there's a bottle of wine on my thing at our first sales convention. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool stuff. And I reached a stage where I couldn't get up out of bed in the morning because I didn't feel like I was being true to my purpose in life. And I wasn't fulfilling that need to be a leader. And so a good friend of mine, a non-commissioned officer, that's what that sword's up there for, got in touch with him and applied to get back in the Army and spent 21 years back in the Army, all the way from captain to full colonel. commanded two air defense artillery batteries, including a test battery for the Army. And then, so I had high visibility all the way up to the Secretary of Defense level. Enjoyed the leadership and responsibility and commanded a Patriot Battalion for 18th Airborne Corps. I got 2 master's degrees. The Army is all about education. I was privileged to attend School of Advanced Military Studies. I was an operational planner during the first Gulf War for an entire armored division in Germany, got them to Saudi Arabia and back in Iraq. So it was really, really fulfilling. So the military stuff was so important to me and to my sense of being responsible and doing something meaningful and important in my life. And I became, as a leader, the Army expects you to be a mentor. And that's planted the seeds, Ben, for all this work that I've been doing since I got out, retired in 2002. And when you get out of the Army, you're looking around, and I wanted to stay in the defense business. Went to work for Raytheon, now RTX, in strategic planning initially, and then business development, and then strategy, and then back to business development. Retired in 2012 after 10 years in Raytheon. And I got to tell you, I was so proud of the men and women, the scientists and engineers and operations staff and everybody in there. I described them as soldiers in a different uniform. And by that time, our 2 boys were both active duty military deployed in combat operations. And so it was very poignant to me to have the men and women making the systems that give our men and women unparalleled advantage. I want them to have an unfair advantage against every enemy that's out there. And so I spent 10 years doing that. And then I woke up one day and decided, you know what? I've worked for other people for 4 decades and I got something left to give. And so you've heard me say it before. How do you define wealth? And for me, owning my calendar for the first time since I was 18 years old was so huge. So I retired from Raytheon in 2012. That's when I pivoted, started my own business, wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I ended up with sick parents and going back and forth to East Texas. Gave me the time to sit back and think. And in that thinking, I ended up writing a book, published it. That was my first, Growing Mentor Intelligence, a field guide to mentoring. That was in 2013. By the way, I took that picture in Sequoia. And then the next year, I published a companion workbook for that. And then I pivoted again after I created a method for mentoring that no one else had done. I needed to do something with it. So I created workshops, and I started going to corporations and giving my presentations, 3 to 5 hour workshops on how to mentor, how to be a better mentor, how to create mentor programs. I did it for nonprofits, for-profits, the Colorado Army National Guard, you name it. And so it's been very rewarding to have that opportunity to give back the benefit of all these years of leading and mentoring.
That is pretty crazy. I'm sure there are people who have done what you've done in that you were with the military, you left, and then you went back. And I say I'm sure there are people who have done it, but I don't know many who have. So that in and of itself is a really interesting aspect of things, that you wanted to be a better leader, and you knew that the Army was a place where you could cultivate that and grow it to what you wanted it to be. I got to ask you, because Procter & Gamble, great company. You mentioned that before, stock owner in P&G, because they are a good company. Got to cover yourself on the consumer staples. When I worked at Coca-Cola, there are a few companies out there in America that I think do a really great job of building products that do great marketing and train people to be good salespeople. P&G is one of those companies. Coca-Cola is one of those companies. In the wine industry, I think Gallo is one of those companies. So coming out of the military, you go to P&G and you're like, now these are people who are known for building up great talent, and you're like, wasn't good enough. and then you went to the medical supply company, and I'm not as familiar with them, but that also didn't quite do it for you. And then you went back into the military. What was it about What is it? What is it that you think you were looking for from a leadership perspective that you couldn't find in some of these other places?
Yeah. So to answer your question, there's a couple of things here. I will paint the picture by what happened when I retired in 2002 as a full colonel, deputy assistant commandant at Fort Bliss, Texas. Ran the Army's Air Defense Artillery School. I was like the number 4 in command of the whole installation and post and stuff like that. So a lot of responsibility, right? And so in 1993 to 95, which was a decade before that, Ben, I was commanding a Patriot battalion for 18th Airborne Corps of over 600 soldiers and 48 Patriot weapon systems, and deployed them to the Middle East right after the Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein was still chunking scuds at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's camel farm. Just the sense of leadership and responsibility was awesome. On top of that, as a soldier, from the time I was a lieutenant to the time that I was a colonel, every time you got promoted, you raised your right hand and you renewed your oath of office. The oath of office is one of the most sacred and important responsibilities that differentiates the military profession from other professions. They're all good. So now I'm retired. It's 2002. I'm looking for a job. I go to work for Raytheon in Bedford, Massachusetts. They even created a position for me, Strategic Initiatives Manager. And I said, okay, so what is that? They say, we don't know. We're creating it just for you. Ben, I went from being a colonel in the Army to being an individual contributor, because that's how HR departments build blocks. And it was so frustrating to me to see so many retired military all over Raytheon with all these decades of leadership and mentorship experience bucketed in a billet and getting paid a whole lot more than they ever got paid in the Army to be an individual contributor. That's what I was missing. I was missing that sense of responsibility. And when I left and retired from the Army, that's what I was missing, because Raytheon is an incredible company. And they're not different than Lockheed Martin or Northrop or Boeing or any of those other aerospace defense firms, in that process by how a person is hired. Now, you can eventually work your way up. And so by the 10-year mark, I was a director and I led a team of 10 business development professionals, most of them retired senior military majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels. But it's a different level of responsibility. There's no feeling like the feeling of standing out there at a change of command ceremony and feeling the sense of pride at taking care of your unit, your men and women, for over 2 years, deploying them to a combat zone and bringing them all back alive. That was so important to me. The level, the sense of responsibility, the sense of purpose, the dedication, my oath of office to the Constitution of the United States, giving myself and my skills and my talents and raising young men and women that America gives the military and turning them into leaders. That was so rewarding and fulfilling. And I got a good bit of that while I was in Raytheon, but nowhere near what I was able to appreciate in my 26 years in the Army.
That's interesting, because what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that the thing that you enjoy more than the work is the people.
Yes.
And that you enjoy the engagement and the collaboration and kind of being able to be in the strategic position of being able to say, hey guys, we're going in this direction and this is why, and I'm bringing you all along with me.
Yeah. And it's, in the Army, there's always been this, is it the mission? Is it the men and women? And I got to tell you, it's yes, it's not a either or, it's an and the thing that I found in my military experience is, if you take care of the men and women that you're entrusted to, whether it's at Raytheon or in the military, there's no mission that they won't accomplish for you and for their unit if they believe in it. But if you're in it for yourself, they're not going to do it. They're just not going to, not to the level. So, yeah, you're right. And it's all about creating a high-performing team that can do incredible things in the face of difficulty. It's easy to be a hero when everything's going right. It's much harder to be a hero when the shit hits the fan and you got to pivot to it, right?
Yeah. It's funny as you were explaining this, as I'm thinking through and taking in what you're saying, it reminds me there's so in academia, and you might have come across this even in leadership studies. Blake and Mountain have this diagram where people are either high task or high people, high results oriented high people, and those people who tend to be low people but high task are the kind of managers that everybody hates them, but they get a lot done.
Exactly. In the short term.
In the short term, right? Yeah. The people who are high people and low task, everybody loves them and they get nothing done.
That's right.
And by the way, we've all worked with these kinds of people, right? And most people strive to be somewhere in the middle of that, where they kind of put team management is in the upper right of that quadrant, which is, to be high task, high people. But that is something it's a little bit of a challenge, because as a business owner, as a business manager, sometimes getting things done means pissing people off. That doesn't always fly well. And right. It's interesting because, at least in my, 30 years of business, what I see is that there is more attention being paid to how people feel versus, and I think we might have talked about this before, but this eudaimonic well-being, which is doing the things that don't necessarily feel good, but are good because it's for the greater betterment of things. And it seems oftentimes, and I it's funny, you talked about being an individual contributor as a bad thing. I love being an individual contributor because people have become sometimes very challenging to get moving in the direction that needs to be done without hurting somebody's feelings or creating some sort of complaint, because you have you have some demands. You have a bar that needs to be raised and you're trying to raise it. And I think one of the challenges for managers these days, so help me with this, Alan, because I'm of an old school mentality when it comes to this, but I don't think we create excellence by lowering the bar. And I don't know that putting feelings ahead of what needs to get done is always the best way of creating success. How do you reconcile that as somebody who, with your kind of background and your experience, how do you view current work environments and strategies, and some thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I got to tell you, in the 10 years that I have been retired from Raytheon and in my own business, working the mentorship thing, I've seen this morph. I've seen it change over time. The thing that that impressed me so much in the military is when I said it's not just the people or the mission, it's both. You can do both and still hold your people accountable. It's in any one of those four quadrants. Accountability is key. And so businesses fall apart if you have a lack of accountability. And you can have a jerk boss with no accountability because he or she doesn't take care of their people, and it's invisible to the senior leaders. Or you can have somebody that only cares about the people and how they feel, and so those hard business decisions don't get made. I gotta tell you too, the thing about individual versus individual contributor versus group. Everybody's carved a little bit differently, and it's about where your passion lies. The whole purpose for me writing these books was really to be built around helping people find their passion. And if you're the kind of person that wants to be an individual contributor, that's my responsibility to help you as a mentor to get there. So anyway, let's go back into this thing about more about how people feel. I did not see that. And from 2002, when I retired from the Army, to 2012, when I retired from Raytheon, in that 10 years, accountability was a big deal at Raytheon. It had to be because we were a Defense Department contractor. We had the same mix of managers as you might imagine, and there were some that were toxic, and those were often handled or coached in some fashion with executive coaches. And you still had to deliver, and the accountability system at Raytheon was built around your annual performance review, where you had to work with your boss. You helped create the performance metrics. They had to be measurable. And once a year, you sat down, and then once you and your boss did it, your boss would sit down with his peers or her peers, and they'd figure out, well, are you the kind of person that needs to move up in the organization or stay the same or whatever? So their system for accountability was pretty rock solid. I was impressed with that. I would say though, there are humane ways to pass bad news to employees, and there are inhumane ways to pass bad news to employees. And here recently, a second level vice president had some bad news to deliver to one of the departments that had many people in it. So he sat down with HR and he built a Zoom video of himself explaining to this organization that they were being disbanded and that many of them were going to lose their job and that some would be asked to stay. And rather than deliver that news face to face with that team, he had them watch it on a Zoom session. That day, one of the directors from that agency posted on LinkedIn. And it's very interesting what happens when the court of public opinion sees a senior leader treat his or her people in that manner, rather than having the moral courage to stand in front of them and say, look, we got to find the efficiencies. The decision's been made. It's a tough decision. And we will, and here's the other piece, we will work with those of you that we're holding on to within the next 2 weeks to let you know that I've mentored several of these people and HR wouldn't even talk to them. They didn't know if they were coming or going. They were in limbo. And then others, they got a surprise phone call. Hey, we're keeping you. Others were just let go.
Yeah.
And they found out on a freaking Zoom meeting. That's irresponsible and bad leadership in my view.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things that I think I talk about often is the fact that we are getting to a point where we don't like to have difficult conversations.
Right.
And we don't want to have those difficult conversations in front of people. And to pre-record something like that, I understand the intent behind it. And maybe they wanted to ensure that, and I'm just guessing here, but in the world that we are in today, where everybody likes to pull out their phone and record things, or even if they're not doing it in your face, they have something being recorded in the room. Maybe this person wanted to make sure that their words were chosen in a way that didn't ignite or create a greater issue. Maybe they weren't a good public speaker. Maybe they just didn't want to risk it by going off script. And I guess I can understand all of those reasons for doing it pre-recorded. But then you also take the humanity out of it. And what then becomes more important? The potential of having misspoken or said a word, because really, honestly, Alan, you damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? If you're not a great speaker publicly and you come out and you got a message to deliver and you're afraid that because of your ad libs, they could be taken out of context and you're going to be roasted for it. Okay, that's a legitimate concern. But then doing it this other way, now you look like somebody who is not in touch with the people. And so that also doesn't work. Like, what do you do?
Well, it is interesting. And back to the damned if you do and damned if you don't. The question is who's damned? And so here's one of the things that I've been often asked now because, 26 years in the Army, 10 with Raytheon, and 11 as a small business owner. I've spent 5 decades in leadership. And so people ask me, what's the most important thing that you've learned? And recently I had to give a presentation about leadership. And one of the lessons learned that I think is kind of bubbled up to the top over the years is that the higher you go, the more important it is to realize the difference as a leader between your intent and the effect you achieve. As a senior leader, your intent is presumed to be good. It's presumed to be good. But the effect that you achieve requires a different level of humility and action. It requires you. So, for example, in the case of the video, there was no way for this senior leader to have a clue what the impact, the effect of that video was on those people, either individually or collectively. So they were damned for whatever reason. Let's just say he was a shitty public speaker or whatever. If he had to stand there and take the heat and answer the questions, maybe he's the one that's damned, but they would appreciate the fact that he had the moral courage to stand in front of them and give the bad news. And that's what I mean by humane. And I think people have generally, they respect a person who is willing to stand and take the heat and be accountable as a senior leader to deliver the bad news. I want to tell you a little side story here. About 3 years ago, Ben, on Facebook, I got a click on Messenger, and it was somebody I didn't know, but the name looked familiar. And this guy was looking, he said, "I'm looking for Colonel Landry from Fort Polk, Louisiana." And are you him? Well, you got to be careful how you answer those questions, right? Why do you want to know? And why are you looking for him? Okay, so I sucked it up and I said, sure, yeah, that's me. I'm him. And he said, I've been waiting for 10 years to tell you this. You saved my life. And I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, when you were a battalion commander at Fort Polk, I was in your supply room. I was a young sergeant. And I had gotten caught DWI because my wife and I were having some marital issues. So it's a big, big deal. It's always been a big deal. He was a non-commissioned officer. And so typically that was not even allowed to be handled at my level. It's always been handled higher. But my boss let me do it. And he said, you call me in, you had a sergeant major in there, and part of the non-judicial punishment was that you had the ability to bust me from E5 sergeant down to specialist E4. And he said, I begged you to not do it, and you did it anyway. And you counseled me about the importance of getting my life together, and that's what I did. I cleaned my act up. I got the drinking under control, divorced my wife, fulfilled my commitment to the Army, got out of the Army, started a business, got married again, and you saved my life. And the whole point is, my intent was always good, but I had no idea what effect I achieved making the right decision. And those are the kind of decisions, the difficult conversations where you can't be too soft. Being soft on your people is not a good thing. That's not caring for your people. Having tough love and holding them accountable. And yet at the same time, and I've said this before, I loved my soldiers. I still love my soldiers. It's a bond that you create when you spend 2 years in the harshest of conditions with these young men and women. And sometimes that love is tough love, and sometimes that love, I ruined some kids' careers. I did it because they weren't able to fulfill their obligations. And I never enjoyed doing it. And some of them probably resented me for it, but I tried to do it in a humane way. I would tell you that all these years later now, I would be a little different. I've matured a little bit, and I would create less collateral damage, understanding the difference between my intent and the effect I achieved. I probably would be a whole lot, I don't want to say a kinder and gentler battalion commander than I was, but less collateral damage. So it's this business about accountability, being humane, and having those difficult conversations, sucking up and having the moral courage to stand in front of the people who are making you successful. And that's the thing that I just think is so important. So it's never just the mission or just the people. If you take care of your people and you're humble about your responsibilities and your leadership, they'll do anything for you, even if you have to tell them, "I'm sorry, but we got to close your section down." Right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really really important and really cool to hear. And I say that because, I think for anybody who's spent any time doing anything, you have to know that time evolves you, and
Yes.
and your
You
judgment, your
learn.
decision making, and how you did things before is
Yeah.
not how you would do things now. And at best you try and pass that along and pass that down to folks, but yeah, through your book, as you have. But and this is, I want to say, like, this is one of the reasons why I feel fortunate to have somebody like you helping me to build this thing that we're all trying to build, because there are a number of times that you've mentioned building legacy and, doing something where you leave your mark. And I remember one time in an interview, interviewing somebody, they came in and they had a very interesting post-interview question, which was, "What do you want written on your headstone?" And I told him, I said, "I'm going to have a web address on my headstone." I said, and then I'm going to go pre-purchase that URL for like 100 years, and I'm going to put a website up, and then that way, when you go to the gravesite, you can look it up, and then there will be the story of me, and you can read all about me. And by the way, we're called the Daily Pitch. I think there's a business there, of putting, like, just even the why I'm drawing a blank on what they are, the QCR codes, like put a QCR
Oh
code on a
yeah,
headstone.
yeah,
or
yeah,
or
yeah. What?
because what's going to happen is we're going to have augmented reality glasses, and we could look at a headstone and it'll scan the QR code, and then what will come up in our heads up display is the whole biography of this person, and it'll have video clips and sound clips and things they've done, and you could just go around the cemetery looking at QR codes the whole time. There's a business in this, I'm telling you.
There's a business there, Ben. I swear, you're ahead of your
Hey guys, we're going into the headstone business. No, but getting back to, I feel real fortunate to have somebody like you being able to help out and advise and coach and, give some leadership guidance and advice to all of us. And, it's one of the reasons why we're documenting this. And what we're doing is we're going to, bring some other board members on and learn more about them and their backgrounds and how they contribute this. Because, folks, building a business is about surrounding yourself with people who want to see you do well. And I think it's one of the things I try and tell my kids is, like, surround yourself with people who want to see you do well for your sake, not you do well for their sake, right?
yeah.
You want to have people who, and by the way, reciprocate that. Like, you don't want to just take. You got to give back. And one of the things, being in academia, teaching classes, it's all about kind of giving back what you know how to do and sharing that
Right.
with other people. And so, that's a little bit of what we're trying to do with DissedMedia as well, is take some intelligence and experience from people and channel that into content that people can learn from, grow from, and thrive from in their careers and whatnot. So I'm just fortunate to have you on board, and I'm glad that we got to, dig a little into who Alan is and where you came from. I have to say, I'm still pretty impressed by the fact that you come out of the military and you're like, no, I could have done more there. And then you go back. That's very cool.
I also left Raytheon within the first year I was with them. I got recruited by the city of El Paso to become their director of economic development. I did that. I got recruited by the mayor. Mayor got beat in a local election, even though I'd been selected by the city council to be the permanent director. The new mayor that came on board wasn't my cup of tea, and I picked up the phone and pivoted again and called my Raytheon buddies and said, "Mea culpa, would you hire me back?" And I did. I went back to work for Raytheon for 9 more years.
I'm encouraged by this, Alan, because if you ever reach out to me and be like, I'm going to dip out, Ben, I'll be like, he'll be back. He'll be back. We're not going to lose him for long. I don't know what he's going off to do, but he won't be doing it for long. Well, Alan, thanks much for sharing a little bit about you with me and with everybody else. Always great to hear from you. We're going to be back next week. We're going to dive a little bit more into DissedMedia, the daily pitch, and we're going to think next week get into a little bit more about content. But Alan, thank you so much for everything. I appreciate it. Any parting words?
Yes. You know I'm going to have a parting word, and my parting word here is something that you told me in one of my first email exchanges with you, where we were talking about, well, you want some content? You're going to pay me? Am I going to lose my intellectual property or whatever? And your response to me was very interesting. You said, my hope is that with DissedMedia, that I can help you grow your business as you help me grow mine. And now in the 3 months or so, 4 months that I've been part of it, I want to say thank you to you for giving me a platform to talk about the things I'm passionate about: mentoring, leadership, strategy, business development, the kinds of things that I feel like I've got something to offer. So I owe you a debt of gratitude, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, and I think on that note, we need to end with you plugging your book. So, title, where can people find it? And let's also leave with what would be one of the nuggets that you think are an important part of your book.
Okay, so first book, Growing Mentor Intelligence, a field guide to mentoring, and then the companion workbook. They comprise a set. They are available on Amazon. And my hope was to help people identify their passion and to create, Ben mentioned the word legacy, to create an enduring and meaningful legacy, what you leave behind. We grow the next generation of leaders through mentorship. And that is the most important thing, so that the leaders that are put in positions of responsibility are up to the task. And then, in last August, a year ago, I took my photography passion to the next level, and I published this book, 100 Days in the Light, A Sojourner's Photo Reflections. And it's full of my reflections that I have posted on nature and on leadership and on life and on legacy and on mentorship, also available on Amazon in ebook form or hard copy or paperback. So I appreciate it. And for every book I sell, I get about $6. So you don't get rich. You don't get rich on that stuff, but you spread the word. So I appreciate all your support, Ben. Thank you.
Well, no problem. And you know what? We are going to work up a section on DissedMedia for publications, and we will put a link on our website to be able to get to your book, and so that you can pick it up at DissedMedia. So if you go to DissedMedia.com, and we'll maybe even do something on the daily pitch as well, because we need to, I think, blow up how we circulate this podcast. I think that might be a good place to do that as well. So
very cool. Very cool.
Alan, thank you again so much for your time. I appreciate it. It was a pleasure as always talking with you, and we'll see everybody again next week.
Yes.
Adios, y'all.